مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
رحم الله من رفع صوته بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. وآل محمد. ثانية غفر الله لكم. ثالثة على حب المولى أبي عبد الله الحسين بأعلى أصواتكم تؤجرون. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Respected sisters, dear brothers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We gather here today to commemorate the end of the season of mourning and tragedy and sadness of Ahlul-Beyt alayhim as-salam, the season of the saga of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam at Karbala. This is also a time not only to commemorate what happened on the land of Karbala when Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam was martyred along with his family members and companions on the land of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram, but also to commemorate the events that happened afterwards and the tragedy that befell the household, the women, the daughters of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam when they were taken captives from Karbala to Kufa, and from Kufa to Sham, and from Sham back to Karbala. This is a time to end a season of mourning and sorrow and tragedy, and therefore it must also be a time when we reflect on what we need to take from all of this season. We have been, inshallah, all of us inspired, recharged spiritually during the days and nights of the holy month of Muharram, the blessed nights where we remember Imam Al-Hasany alayhi salam and his tragedy, along with the month of Safar, these times when we mention Ahlul-Beyt alayhim salam and remembered their tragedies. And there is no doubt that when it comes to these events that transpired and occurred, they are horrific events. They are events that are full of tragedy and sorrow and sadness and calamities and difficulties for the family members of Ahlul-Beyt alayhim salam. The question that we need to start asking ourselves, however, is that when we look at the captives, the caravan of the captives, the women, the children, the daughters of Imam Al-Hasany alayhi salam, and some of his companions, in the presence of our Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam, Ali ibn al-Husayn, the son of Imam Al-Husayn alayhi salam, and the Imam after him, the question needs to be, how did they behave? How did they conduct themselves during the time that they were taken as captives and afterwards? When they were taken as captives, did they simply submit and give up to their fate? Were they simply taken as victims to be paraded by Bani Umayyah, as we know? They were taken from land to be paraded as captives, as prisoners, after Imam Al-Husayn alayhi salam had been martyred, with the heads, the holy head of Imam Al-Husayn alayhi salam and his companions carried before them. Did they simply submit to their fate? Were they passive victims? Wherever they are taken, they are simply taken. Whatever they are told to do, they simply do, submitting completely to their fate? Or did they play a more active role? And this is where we have to start, by looking at the behavior of this caravan, of these captives, to start to see that there are perhaps lessons for us to learn from them. When we look at the tragedy of Karbala and what happened in Karbala, we know that these captives witnessed everything. They did not hear secondhand about the horrific events of Karbala. They lived them. They experienced those events. They were there on the 10th of Muharram. And then they were the same people who were taken captives and prisoners by people who were known to be ruthless, to be barbaric. They were taken as prisoners, and perhaps if we were to think about someone in their situation, what we should expect is that they simply give up, that they simply submit to their fate. Passive victims. Except that when we look at their conduct and their behavior, we see that this is not what happened. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Not only did they not submit to their fate, they became very active participants. And they played a very clear leadership role. And their behavior and their conduct inspired generations upon generations of people. And if we wanted to look at what they did, the lessons would be too many to list. Part of their lessons have to do with how everyone ought to learn from them how to be patient and how to show perseverance and resilience and strength in the face of the greatest disasters, in the face of the greatest challenges, in the face of calamities where other people crumble, where all else seems to fall apart. The more grave the situation became, the more disastrous the situation became, the more these people seem to shine. There are also lessons that we can learn from them that have to do with bravery, with courage, with standing up for what you believe in, with standing up about the wrongs of the world, the injustice, the oppression of the world. These people did not have to show this type of bravery, this type of courage, especially in that type of situation. I do not think that anyone would have expected them to continue to stand up to the truth and to justice against oppression in such situations. But we see the exact opposite from them. And then there are more practical considerations from them. Some of the very special roles that they played as captives, as a caravan of captives, being the captives of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, being the family, the extension of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Tonight, inshallah, this is where we're going to try to focus, to try to see what are some of the more important functions that they performed, and what do we learn from those functions? Because perhaps today we need to carry the same responsibility that they carried. But we need to understand what was the role that they were trying to play. Why is it that Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam took them with him? But before we answer this question, to better understand their role, we need to understand the context of the saga of Karbala. We need to better understand the battle and the nature of the enemy. 2 points, so that we don't extend the discussion too long. 1 point about the context has to do with Karbala. Karbala as a land and Karbala as a battle. That's the first point of context. The second point of context has to do with the strategies of Bani Umayyah against Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Regarding the first point about Karbala, when Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam arrives at Karbala, Karbala is a distant land. It's a barren land. There are very few towns and very few people living there. Pretty much today we would say completely empty, far away from the major cities, major towns. And this is where Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam established, or was forced to establish, his camp. This is the geography. What about the battle? Slowly the enemy started to surround Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam in an area that is already secluded, an area that is already far away from the big towns and the big centers. And the thousands upon thousands of soldiers started to surround Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam from every side. According to the different reports in history, the lowest number that we have is that the army was around 30,000. Perhaps they were 70, perhaps they were 90, perhaps they were even 120,000. And then what happens? The battle ensues while Karbala is already a secluded land, while Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam and his companions are now cut off from the rest of the world by their enemies. The battle happens. Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam is martyred, killed, along with his companions and family members. All of this you know. But I'm trying to focus on 1 point. All of this is happening away from everyone else on earth. No one on earth is witnessing this. In a land far away that is completely cut off, and the main participants in the battle have all been killed. The only people left are the enemies. And they get to tell the story however they want, except for the captives. That's one part of the context. The second part of the context, there are Bani Umayyah. One of the main strategies of work of Bani Umayyah is that they always try to control the story. This is an important lesson for today's world. Bani Umayyah were masterminds at coming up with ways to control what people are exposed to, what people hear, what people see, so that the masses and the population only hears their version, only hears a side of the story and a version of the story that matches the interests of Bani Umayyah. This is how they operate. And Bani Umayyah dedicate resources, significant resources to this. They bribe, they force, they threaten the main sources of information in society to ensure that the story that comes out matches their interests, matches what they want people to hear, what they want people to know. So they go after the most important figures. They threaten them, they bribe them, they find a way to get them to say what they want, or they get rid of them. They do that with judges, they do that with scholars, they do that with narrators of ahadith. Anyone who is influential in society, Bani Umayyah will reach them and will try to ensure that they control what comes out of that person. This was their strategy very clearly at the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam. Muawiyah was prolific at managing his rule in this way. And this is no time to go through the different strategies they used against Imam Ali. But clearly, they tried to do this with Imam Ali alayhi salam. And they tried to do this in the same way with Imam Al-Hasany alayhi salam. And these are the same people who were there at the time of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, and they tried to do the same thing. They want to control what people hear and what people know about Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. And if you go back in history, you notice that Bani Umayyah focused on two traits about Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Of course, two false traits. But everywhere you see someone speaking on behalf of Bani Umayyah, you see that these traits come back in their sermons, in their speeches, in their letters, which means that this is not random. This is part of a campaign against Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Today we would call it a misinformation or disinformation campaign against Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. What are the two traits? The first one is that Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam is a liar. The second trait is that Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam is a khariji. These come back and again in all of their sermons. Ubaydullah bin Ziyad, when he gave a sermon, when people come and present their case to Yazid, this is constantly what comes back. Which means that this is the deliberate plan to ensure that these are the two labels that people know about Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. If they know nothing else, this is all they know. That he was a liar and that he was a khariji. He was a liar, meaning that now anything you hear from Imam Al-Hussein, about Imam Al-Hussein, why he came to Karbala, what happened during his time, if you ever hear that the Imam came because people invited him, asked him to become the ruler, that's why he went to Kufa, lie. So all of that loses legitimacy. That's the easy one. The label of Khariji is a little bit more complex. This is where you see Bani Umayyah really at work. How they work. How devious they are. It's a sophisticated, complex way of controlling the story. Who were the Khawarij? The Khawarij were a well-known entity. They were a group of people with an ideological background, with extreme views, extremist views, and extremist ways of understanding religion, very superficial. They were a splinter group in Islam. They left the rest of Islam behind and they created their own version of Islam. That's why they were called Khawarij. Almost like they are outsiders. They emerged mostly at the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam during his battles with Muawiyah. To the majority of people, they would consider them to be, and that's how they presented themselves to the world, as being an opposition group to both Imam Ali alayhi salam and to Muawiyah. But in truth, if we dig in history, we see that Muawiyah was secretly working with them. Behind the scenes, he was funding their campaigns. He worked closely with them. He planned for the attack against Imam Ali alayhi salam. He had Imam Ali alayhi salam martyred, killed in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan in that horrific way with the poisoned sword. All of that was Muawiyah. But who was the face of the operation? The Khawarij. These are the people who, in appearance, killed Imam Ali alayhi salam. And now Bani Umayyah were saying that his son is one of the Khawarij, which does not make any sense. So they changed the definition of a Khariji. They labeled the Imam, this is a confusion that they create. They labeled the Imam as a Khariji, but now the new definition of a Khariji is that it is someone who opposes the rule. Anyone who opposes the legitimate rule, by their claim, Yazid is the legitimate ruler. If you oppose the legitimate ruler, you are a Khariji. And so therefore Imam al-Hussein is a liar and a Khariji. So in short, a strong PR, disinformation, call it whatever you want, campaign against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam to ruin, to tarnish his reputation, who he is, how he rose, why he rose, what he was against, what he stood for, as a strategy of Bani Umayyah, and the entirety of what happened and what transpired was completely cut off from the world. As a land, geographically, and the manner in which the battle was conducted. If we understand all of this, then we can go back to the captives, the caravan of the captives of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The role of the women and the children who were taken captives, and perhaps start understanding one of the answers. Why does Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam take these women with him, knowing that they may be one day captives after he is martyred? Because the Imam alludes to this and talks about this. And he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, while he's leaving Medina, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see them taken captives. What does the Imam mean by this? When we come back now, after the events of Karbala, and we analyze the situation, and we see what happened, keeping this context in mind, we start to understand some of the wisdom behind this. If the entirety of the event of Karbala is cut off from the world, and if Bani Umayyah are doing everything they can to control the version of the story that comes out to the world, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam needs one thing that is very special, one function, one role, without which Karbala is incomplete. The project of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam cannot work. The mission of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam only works if it reaches the world. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam needs a voice. Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam needs a mouthpiece to explain to the world what happened in Karbala. Why did Karbala happen? What did Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam stand for? What were his values? What were his principles? What were his beliefs? What were the events that actually took place in Karbala? Without this piece, the tragedy of Karbala would have remained a completely unknown tragedy. No one would know about what happened in Karbala. Completely secluded land, in an area where the enemy controlled and cut off Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam away from the world, and an enemy that did everything they can, because that's how they worked, and they did it intentionally against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, to control the message, to decide what people would hear. And it was certainly not the truth. That is not in their interest. A completely different version of reality would have come out, if anything. Instead, today, 14 centuries later, we're sitting here talking about the tragedy of Karbala in detail, remembering Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The details that we know are not little. We know a lot about what happened in Karbala. From the time the Imam left Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara till the time he went to Mecca, till the time that he went to Karbala, day by day, night by night in Karbala until the 10th, and what happened to the captives afterwards. Here we are 14 centuries later, talking about it in detail, and feeling and experiencing the tragedy of Karbala, and being attached to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in a way that we do not see anyone else on earth being attached to anyone or anything in history in this way. We can't think of a person in history where people show this type of devotion and loyalty and passion and warmth towards. There's no event and there is no person for whom humanity has done this. And a person who was completely cut off from the world. And we're not the only ones here. We're not a splinter group. We're not a minority. Today, as we are doing this, there are tens of millions, not to say hundreds of millions around the world doing the same thing. And this has been happening in a continuous way for 14 centuries. How? This is the secret of the success of the mission, the project, the saga of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The captives that he took with him. This is why they are special. And this is why we insist on commemorating them. Sometimes we focus on the tragedy of Karbala. And Karbala is full of tragedies. We look at the events that happened and we say Karbala is two halves, two parts tragedy. There's a tragedy that began and ended with the killing of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his companions on the 10th of Muharram. And there's another tragedy that began on the 10th of Muharram. And that's true. But I don't think that tells the full story. It takes away from the credit, the splendor, the amazing work that these captives did. We need to talk about the whole mission of Imam al-Hussein, the entirety of the saga of Imam al-Hussein, and say the saga and the mission of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is made up of two halves. There's the half that he carried alone all the way to his martyrdom on the 10th of Muharram. And there's a second half of the saga of Imam al-Hussein where he needed very special people to be able to carry his voice to the world. Otherwise, no one would know about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And so the people that came with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam can certainly not be normal people. Imam al-Hussein is the wisest of the wise. Imam al-Hussein has the best of judgments. He is the one who chose who would accompany him. As he did with the men, ensuring that whoever stays until the end and fights with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam are only the purest, the bravest, the most worthy, the most loyal to be part of this. And in the same way, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam did the same thing for the caravan of the women and the children who were to come with him. These were people who were handpicked by Imam al-Hussein. Imam al-Hussein knew what would transpire afterwards. He knew what he needed from those people. It has to be people that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam knows can carry this responsibility, can deliver his voice to the rest of the world. And they have the strength, the resilience, the patience, the will to do so. Despite the calamities, despite the challenges, despite the difficulties. These were not random people. They wanted to be there. Just like the men would tell Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, if they would take us and kill us 1,000 times, and we were brought back to life every time, we would come back and die for you and with you. The women who were part of the caravan of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam did not have any less faith or any less loyalty to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And they understood their roles. And this is exactly what we see them do. None of them showed weakness. None of them gave up. This is not normal behavior for people who go through these types of tragedies. When we look at the sequence of events that happens, there are a few things around this role that this caravan plays that we need to be aware of, and it needs to be front and center for us today. Because these are practical considerations. This is not history. This is our reality today, and inshallah for the future. The first has to do with documenting the event. The fact that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is remembered and commemorated in a continuous way, in a detailed way, across this time span, means that there is less and less room for anyone else to come and present a different version of what happened in Karbala, or why Karbala happened. As we said, the campaign of disinformation against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam began in his own lifetime and continued afterwards. Immediately after the killing of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, they started to change and distort the truth and present a completely different version of the events. And what prevented this from happening is this documentation that came from the captives. And inshallah we'll talk about this shortly. The work that they did, that today we call al-majalis. How quickly they started to organize gatherings to commemorate Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, to remember the martyrdom in detail, to recite what we call the maqtal today. This is so that we document the event for ourselves, for the next generations, and not leave any space and any room, a vacuum, a void, for others to come and distort the event. This is a necessity. This is a duty. The documentation of the history, the sequence of the events that happened is necessary. This is part of the communication that is required around Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. The second point that we learn from them is that by communicating the tragedy of Karbala and the voice of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in this way to the world, you are announcing to the world who you are. You're not just telling a story. The narrator, the participant, as inshallah we all are today, the one who participates in one way or another in this act of communicating the story of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, you're stating something. You're sending a message to the world. You're announcing something. Which is what? Which is to tell the world, these are the values that I believe in. These are the principles I stand for. These are my role models. This is my identity. I may not be able to execute it perfectly, but I know where I stand. I know where I am headed. I know who I am. We live in a world, and this has always been the case, where there are all sorts of pressures on us to be in a certain way, to act in a certain way, to think in a certain way, to believe certain things. People who attach themselves to Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, they are telling the world, I know who I am. I know where I stand. I know what I believe. I don't need any other role models. I have Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. I have Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. I have my role models. I'm not at a loss. I'm not confused. I'm not weak. I know my values and my beliefs and my identity. Commemorating the events of Imam Al-Hussein and communicating them to the world sends this message indirectly. You don't need to say that. You don't need to tell the world, I know where I stand. The world understands. All you need to do is to say, this is my Hussein. This is my Imam. This is the Karbala that I believe in. That's it. And the world will know where you stand. And the world will know what your identity is, what your values are, your role models. All of that will become clear by itself. When we follow the chronological order of events that happened in Karbala, we see that the heroes who were present at the time personified all of this very clearly. They were taken as prisoners from Karbala to Kufa, and from Kufa to Sham. From Sham, they were meant to go to Medina, but they turned in the way towards Karbala to give their last farewells to Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, and then go back to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. That was their journey. If we were to go back and analyze and look at their journey, we would see that at every step of the way, they personified everything we just talked about. To raise the awareness, to educate people about who Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam is and what he stood for, and to fight against the lies and the distortions that were being made up against him, and to ensure that all of this is spread far and wide in the world. At a world that was very hostile to that, in a world where it was very difficult to get that message to spread, I would argue in a way that is very contrary to what we have today. If I want to spread a message today, it is very easy to do. In that world, it was very difficult to do. And they were still able to be successful doing that. We focus on the two biggest heroes in this saga. The first one is the Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. This woman who was a mountain of patience, perseverance, wisdom, judgment, bravery, unmatched. And that's why many say she is only second to Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam in carrying his message. Because she was the hero of the second part of the saga. And it is not to say that she is greater as a person than Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. But in a lot of the cases, in a lot of the circumstances, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam could not be at the forefront. During the time that he was a captive, Imam Sajjad was almost killed multiple times. When he spoke against Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he wanted to kill him immediately. And Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam protected him. When he went to Sham and he spoke with Yazid, the first thing Yazid wanted to do was to have him killed. And Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam protected him. And the Imam was not killed. Imam Sajjad could not be at the forefront. He continued to lead the entire saga, but in a lot of cases, indirectly, through Zainab alayhi salam. And this requires a separate discussion for another day. Our Imams, we have narrations that talk about this. and how Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam played the intermediary role. How people would come seeking guidance, seeking knowledge from the Imams, and the one who would answer was Zainab alayhi salam, because Imam Sajjad could not answer. Our Imams explained this to us. Beyond all of this, she remained unshakable, wise, strong, brave, eloquent. And the manner in which she carried this function of communication is very clear. When they went to Kufa, she delivered that sermon full of eloquence, but it performed the functions that Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam needed. She exposed Bani Umayyah, she exposed their lies, and she did something to the society of Kufa. She filled them with guilt and regret, which later, if you study history, you see was perhaps the spark that led to multiple revolutions afterwards, of people who wanted to avenge the blood of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, all of them starting from Kufa. The spark was this speech from Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. And then when they went to Sham, she delivered another incredible speech. This one again, many historians who have looked at the speech say, this is the speech that shook the foundations of the rule of Bani Umayyah. If you imagine their dynasty, their empire as a building, this is the speech that started to make it crumble, started to shake its foundations. This is a woman who has gone through all these calamities and all these difficulties, who has suffered all of this, who has seen her own sons, her own brothers, the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam slaughtered in that way in Karbala, then taken captive from land to land. And she stands in front of the tyrant himself, and she delivers her amazing, incredible, eternal words, in which she tells Yazid, فَكِدْ كَيْدَكْ وَاسْعَ سَعْيَكْ فَوَاللَّهِ لَا تَمْحُو ذِكْرَنَا وَلَا تُمِيتُ وَحْيَنَا. She tells Yazid, the ruler, the tyrant himself, we have to try to put ourselves in this situation. They're easy words to say. Put yourself in that situation at that time. To stand in front of Yazid at that time and to tell him, you may plot away, scheme away, pour your energy. I swear that you will never be able to eradicate our remembrance, nor will you ever be able to extinguish the inspiration that we cause in people's minds and hearts. And today, 14 centuries later, her words cannot be more true. Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, after this speech, we are told, perhaps this speech or the speech delivered by Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, this became the talk of the town. People started to criticize Yazid from inside his own castle. People who were advisors to Yazid were telling him, perhaps this is not the best way to deal with this situation, to be harsh with them, to be violent with them, to be rude with them. People are turning against you. And so Yazid started to change his approach. And he started to lay the blame on Ubaydullah bin Ziyad, saying, I had nothing to do. I did not order the killing of Imam al-Hussein. It was Ubaydullah bin Ziyad, my governor in Kufa, who took the decision by himself. I would have accepted much less. All the books of history say this. Why? It's not that he suddenly had a change of heart. With a couple of speeches, this caravan was able to change the hearts and minds. This is the strength of the communicative function, the role that this caravan was performing. And then when she went back to Medina, Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam, of course, was with the rest of the caravan until they went back to Medina al-Munawwara. She continued to play the same role. She continued to gather the people and to commemorate the remembrance of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Non-stop. She would deliver speeches and gather people and make sure that people remember Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam all the time in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. And that's why we are told that about 1 year later, the governor of the Medina wrote to Yazid telling him, I cannot continue to rule over Medina if this woman stays here. She has turned all the people against you, and you have lost control of Medina al-Munawwara. Deal with it. I cannot continue to rule as a governor, as your governor over Medina. And so Yazid sent instructions, and Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam was removed forcibly from Medina. She was deported. She was forced into exile from Medina al-Munawwara. She went towards Sham. This is where the life of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam becomes ambiguous if you go back in history. We don't have a lot of details of what happened or exactly where she went. She headed towards Sham. And it seems that Yazid pretended that he was going to send her some girls to serve her. But in fact, what seems to have happened is that these girls were sent to poison Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. And she died right afterwards. This was the end of the life of Sayyidah Zainab alayhi salam. A year or so after the tragedy of Karbala. During the short time that she stayed alive after the tragedy, her sole and main function was to continue to spread the message of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. And she did it so effectively that the governor had to get rid of her. And Yazid himself had to send someone to get rid of her, to understand the role that these people played. And the same thing we can say about Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam. Perhaps not always as directly, but very clearly, throughout the journey of the captives, all the way till the end, Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam performed this role. It was not about him. It was not about, we are victims, we are weak, we have been abused, harassed, maltreated, tortured. Not a mention of that. Not once. The entire message, throughout the entire journey, was about Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. Who was Imam Al-Hussein? What he represented? How he is the descendant of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How he is the purest form of the religion of Islam. That he could never therefore be a liar. That he could never therefore be someone who is an outsider to this religion. No one else represents this religion better than Imam Al-Hussein. And those who are left behind, the captives, they are his extension. And as soon as people start to understand this, then the equation changes completely. Until Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam came close to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. Now they are headed back home. And this is where we notice, and this is the final point that we make. This is where we notice that the how of the message is as important as the what. When Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam, leading the caravan back to Medina al-Munawwara, gets close, there's a man who says, I came to Imam As-Sajjad alayhi salam. His name is Al-Bashir ibn Hidlam. When he comes close to the Imam, he tells him, Imam alayhi salam, he says, the Imam saluted me, then he told me, may God have mercy upon your father. He was a poet. Are you also a poet, like your father? And the man says, I told the Imam, yes, I write and recite poetry. The Imam tells him, then go to the Medina and announce the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. We have to pause here. The Imam does not need to do that. The Imam is eloquent. The Imam can recite poetry. The Imam does not need to stand or stop in the middle of the way. This man says, and the Imam set his camp outside Medina. He did not enter. He stayed outside Medina al-Munawwara with the rest of the camp. He says, I rode my camel and I rushed inside Medina al-Munawwara. But we have to ask ourselves a question here. Why does the Imam do this? This is a lesson for us. If we want to play the same role as these captives, we need to be the voice of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. And we need to do this effectively, wisely. The Imam chose the most effective tool at that time. He chose a poet, an expert in his field of communication, to communicate the message in the best way possible. We need to do the same thing today. Each one of us needs to think, from everything that I know, from my expertise, from my interests, from my hobbies, how can I communicate the message of the Imam? And we need everything. We need posters, we need marches, we need books, we need conferences, we need short clips, animations, movies, theater, art, poetry. The message is as important as how the message is delivered. Whoever has expertise needs to think about, how do I deliver this message? At that time, it was through poetry. Today, what does it look like? Maybe it looks like shorts through social media. Whatever it may be, we need to think about this and think about, what role am I playing in this today? Am I contributing? I know how to use social media. Am I doing anything with that? Am I being the voice of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, as I'm supposed to learn from the captives? Or am I falling short? Can I do more? And what's the most effective way that I can contribute? Because how I contribute is different from how you contribute. Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam tells Bashir, go and announce the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. The man says, I rode my animal and I rushed towards the grave of the Holy Prophet ﷺ in Medina. When I arrived, he says, I stood on top of my camel or my horse. I stood on top of my animal. This is a man who knows what he's doing. That's why the Imam sends him. He knows how to communicate with these people in an expert way. He says, and I cried and I wept aloud for a long time. No words, just crying, until the people gathered. And when the people gathered, I recited my poetry. يا أهل يثرب لا مقام لكم بها قتل الحسين فأدمعي مدرار الجسم منه على الثرى مجرد والرأس منه على القناة يدار. He says, I told the people of Yathrib, of Medina al-Munawwara, this is the hometown of the Holy Prophet. This is supposed to be the hometown of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And here is the caravan of Imam al-Hussein coming back, but there is no Hussein. So he said the words that the people of Medina understand. He tells them, O inhabitants, O residents of Medina, you're no longer welcome to stay as residents of Medina. Why? Hussein has been killed. He has not come back. Why would you stay in his hometown if the Hussein has not come back? So I will continue to weep over him, he says, with a downpour of tears. Why? Because of the horrific way that he has been killed. His body was left naked on the ground, while his head was being paraded on top of a spear. He says the people came out, crying, hitting themselves, lamenting. And I told them, go and greet your Imam, go and greet the son of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam at the entrance of the city. And the people rushed to Imam Al-Sajjad Zayn Al-Abidin alayhi salam. And he says, I rushed back with them, but there were so many masses that I could not make it on my camel or on my horse. So I got off of it to push myself through to get to the Imam and to see what was happening. And he says the Imam, they had installed a small chair for him on the ground, and he was sitting on that chair crying. And the people had gathered around the Imam crying. And the Imam delivered a sermon. The Imam is establishing the first majlis in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwar. And then he went inside. And the rest of the life of the Imam did not change. Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam, when you study his life, his sons tell us, Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam says, that my father took for himself a house made of hair. It's mentioned in the books of history. Hair meaning the hair of camels. It's a tent that the Imam took for himself as residence in Al-Badiyah, outside in the desert. And Imam Al-Baqir alayhi salam tells us why he did this. Because he says, and he frequently visited the grave of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam in Iraq. This gave freedom to Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam to go back and forth without anyone noticing where he's going. And if people hear that Imam Al-Sajjad is performing the ziyarah of Imam Al-Hussein, what do? They perform the ziyarah. This is a communicative function. He's communicating a message. And Imam Al-Baqir says, there are times when he would not go all the way to the grave. Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam would stop in the way so that he greets the people going to perform the ziyarah. And he would prepare food for them, Imam Al-Baqir says. As he would prepare food for the majalis that the women of Bani Hashim would organize and gather around in Medina. He ensured that the time that they are spending doing this, they don't get distracted. He wants to serve them, so he prepares food and brings it to them. And he would make food and make it ready for the people visiting Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, making sure that they have everything they need when they perform this visitation. Is that different from what we notice today? As people go and perform their ziyarah, what was the beginning of all of this? Who established these rituals? This is Imam Al-Sajjad himself. He is the one who is establishing this. And then the last example we give from Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam as a communicator and a voice to Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam is through the emotional dimension. The way you connect with Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam universally. The universal language that every human being understands. You don't need to do intellectual analysis for this. You connect with Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam and his tragedy with your emotions. All human beings understand this. Young and old. Intellectuals, plain simple people. Rich and poor. Regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your religion. If you are a human being with a beating heart, you connect with Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam through your emotions. Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam, he was an imam for over 34 years. 34 years he did this. The riwayat, they all use the same language. They say, never did they present food or water to Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam without him crying over Imam Al-Hussein. This went on for 34 years. In the riwayat, they say he would mix the food and the water with his tears. To the point where the family members of Imam Al-Sajjad would go see some of the companions who were left still alive of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, telling them, go, we beg of you, go and talk to the Imam. He's going to perish. He cried so much, he weeps so much about Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam. So they would come and they would talk to Imam Al-Sajjad alayhi salam. And they would tell him, son of the messenger, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it a habit of yours. You are Ahlul-Beyt. Your habit is that you are killed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is God's honor for you. And the Imam would respond saying, I don't cry because Imam Al-Hasany alayhi salam was martyred. I cry because, have you ever heard of the woman of Bani Hashim taken captives and paraded from town to town before? I swear to you, he says in the riwayah, I swear to you that every time I look at my sisters and my aunts, I remember how they had to flee, to run away from one tent to another in Karbala, not knowing what to do, while the oppressors and the enemies are yelling out, destroy the houses of the oppressors. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.